Well, James, I think we're quarried. If you'd like to kick off
Good.
the shindig.
Yeah. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining on a Monday evening. My name is James Hayr, and I'm a quarter owner of the Neuronarrative Lab alongside these fine gentlemen next door to me. It's Professor Joseph Devlin, who's Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL, and his colleague Daniel Richardson, who's Professor of Experimental Psychology, also at UCL. My other business partner, Jules Fuller. Me and Jules, we run a branded content consultancy business, which basically we have about 30 years experience in the advertising and content industry. Now, I know we look a bit like an outtake from one flew over the cuckoo's nest, but sort of kind of bear with us, and hopefully there'll be some method in the madness at the end of this. I just want to give you some context, just a couple of minutes, just to explain kind of how we got here today. And like all best backstories, they sort of started at a dinner party. So Jules met Joe at a dinner party, had one of those awkward moments of, what do you do? Oh, I'm a neuroscientist. This could be a long night. But actually what it turned into was actually quite an interesting conversation about some work that Joe and Dan had been doing in the neuroscience space that we felt would be very applicable to the advertising and the content industry. So I guess our background is that we knew what we kind of knew about research, and a lot of work that we've done has gone into research and checking people's reactions to content, if they like it, if they don't like it, if we change it, does it make a difference? And we kind of knew what we knew, and we worked with the likes of Lumen and Nielsen, and a lot of the industry works with System One and companies like that. But as we all know, although no one told us, the science actually evolves, and what the guys have done is they've discovered some really interesting new technology that we think we should share with the advertising industry, that we think goes a bit deeper in terms of giving genuine and effective and credible analytics when you're researching content, whether that content's an ad, or it's a social content, or it's a trailer to a movie, whatever it may be. So we spent the last 9 months kind of working with the guys. We've set a business up, and we've tested some of this already with mainly media owners, actually. So DTM Cinema, the Outernet, Finecast, businesses like that. And actually, it's got some real traction. So we thought, well, how can we apply this more broadly to the advertising industry? And so today is the culmination of that. I've sat through enough seminars and conferences to know that sort of the attention economy is kind of the big thing at the moment. But actually, well, hopefully we'll realise today that we can go a bit further than attention and actually look at engagement, which gives us a much more realistic and true reflection of people's reaction to content. So welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us. The guys will take over and explain kind of what the science means and how it works. And at the end, Jules will take you through a kind of an offer that we've got for people who want to take the conversation further and actually test some of this for themselves. So thank you very much for joining. And Joe, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, James. Much appreciated. My name is Joe Devlin, and as James has already said, I'm a neuroscientist at UCL. A lot of the science that we're going to be taking you through today is work that Daniel and I have done, where we were just looking at trying to understand how audiences engage with creative materials, right? And obviously the traditional answer is, well, you just ask them. And that's the main technique that's used in any sort of typical market research. You do interviews, you do focus groups, you do surveys and questionnaires, and that's great. There's no problem with those things, but there are limits to what they can get you. And the question that Daniel and I were trying to ask was, given that the information is still being processed in your nervous system, are there any sort of tools of neuroscience that we can use to try to get at this information? And that was what got us set off on this path. As we say, at some point, we met Jules and James and realized that some of this material that we had been just doing in academia might actually have real life applications that are relevant to the rest of the world, and we're here tonight. So what I want to do is start off by talking a little bit about attention and the attention economy versus engagement a little bit more deeply. So just to start, one of the things that's, a big issue is, well, what exactly is attention, right? Is it just eyeballs on the screen? Is there something more to it? And if you go back to the sort of foundations of psychology, there's a quote from William James, who's literally the father of modern psychology, who says, everybody knows what attention is. It's the taking of possession of the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. And just this idea, Daniel, if you don't mind, one, that everybody knows what attention is actually kind of tricky, because we all have an intuitive sense what it is. And I think he captures the idea that attention is focusing your processing on a sort of limited set of the possible things that are surrounding you. But sometimes that's done with your eyes, sometimes that's done with your ears, sometimes that happens in other ways. And it actually turns out to be really difficult. Like neuroscience hasn't agreed on a single definition of attention. So what if we just sort of skip that right away and go right to the brain and say, well, what's happening in your brain when you attend? And there are different ways of measuring this. Just on the left of the image, I'm showing data from what's called electroencephalography, or EEG. And one of the things that we know is that there's a particular kind of brain wave called a P300, which is shown in orange there, which happens when your attention gets captured by something. There's some surprise in your environment, like the cat that just showed up next to James, and it captures your attention, and your brain waves will reveal this particular P300. But if you look on the right, then in this case, we're using MRI to sort of scan what's happening in the brain in terms of the systems of brain regions that activate. And two of the ones in the front, Daniel, if you don't mind, just one more button, are called the frontal eye fields. And they're very much active, specifically when you're sustaining visual attention. So you're actually sort of looking at something, right? And this is the attention that most of us tend to think about, particularly in advertising, because we're looking at like eyeballs on the ad, whether it's digital or out of home or TV, whatever the case may be. And this leads to the use of eye tracking. So these various companies that sort of look at ads, like this one, which I'll just let play for a second. Oh, I'm a little slow. It's a cute ad, right? And this is an example that Nielsen IQ have shared with us, and asked, allowed me to share with you guys. And Daniel, if you just take it a step further, what was really interesting was they did the eye tracking, and they found that when you did the original ending, which is just what we played, you can look at this little heat map, and you can see that the eyes are mostly on the dog and not very much on the call to action, right? The charity component. And they found that the ad wasn't performing that well. But they did a re-edit at the end where they simply removed the dog from the final screen, which is the eye tracking that you can see on the right. And you can see that actually people were attending to the call to action. And it made a big difference in terms of the hits on their website and click-throughs and responses that they were getting. So this is a really good example of this ability to use eye tracking and look at visual attention in this kind of a context. Daniel, if you don't mind moving on to the next one. But what I want to ask is attention all we really need, right? So if you think about the sort of traditional marketing funnel, that top level of awareness is essentially attention. So Daniel, if you don't mind clicking once, right? And this is what we can measure with eye tracking in typical fashion. But it's really only the very top. It's part of what we want, but it's not all of what we want. And let me just give you a quick example for why attention sometimes isn't enough, particularly via eye tracking. So what I want to do is play you an image that is going to start changing, and there'll be two images. There will be a difference between the two of them. And what I'd like you to do is just simply raise your hand on the screen when you see what's changing. So Daniel, if you don't mind giving it a start. This always gets me because it's really hard for me not to see what's changing. But I guarantee that something is changing and that you'd really care. A few people have noticed it. When you do this live, there's always someone in the room who goes, oh, and that's when you know it's okay. Right, okay, so we've gotten quite a few people who are starting to recognize what's changing. And as I said, I bet you can't unsee it now, right? Daniel, if you don't mind just stopping this. What I want to do, whoops, the screen just went a little crazy.
Sorry.
There we go. Is if you don't mind focusing on the engine next to that man's shoulder. So just focus your eyes over there. And then Daniel, if you don't mind restarting it. So what's changing is the giant jet engine is leaving the image. And what's remarkable is that's sitting there on your eye. And okay, you can stop this. We're all going to go mad. And yet it's still really hard to see it. So even the attention, the visual attention is there. It's at the right part of the image. And nonetheless, we don't get the content change. And this is kind of what I mean. Attention is important, but visual attention is limited. It doesn't always tell you exactly what you think it tells you. So if we rethink about this marketing funnel, Daniel, just one more, in terms of the components, what we're really interested in, one more, Daniel, is sort of the top three, right? So this combination of attending to the content, how you engage with the content in terms of its emotion, and how well you recall the content. And those are the things that actually drive behavior. And that's what we want to do. We want to influence consumer behavior by making people more aware of our products and services, and make them more interested in them, right? So Daniel, if you don't mind stepping forward. So one very cool study that came out just about 10 years ago at this point was by Michalski and colleagues. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing this poor person's name. But what they did was they used EEG, electroencephalography, and fMRI, functional magnetic resonance, with a small set of volunteers, 12 in each. And they played them a bunch of Super Bowl ads from the US, right? And these are ads that are designed to be very high quality, good creative content. They spend millions every year on these. But they vary in terms of how effective they are. And what Michalski and colleagues did was they measured the brain activity in these volunteers, these small neurofocus groups, with either the brain waves or the neural activity with fMR, and they looked at how similar all those participants' brain activity was. They measured what's called neural synchrony. And what they found was that neural synchrony, which they've labeled neural reliability here in this image, was actually predictive of how well those ads did on social media, how widely they were shared in the real world. So even with just a really small sample, like 12 volunteers, they were able to predict market level performance by measuring how similar the brain response was in audience members. And to some extent, this makes some intuitive sense, which is to say that if you're attending to it, if you're engaged with the content, your brain activity is being driven by that content, and therefore your activity, my activity are going to be relatively similar to each other. So you can measure this quantitatively and non-invasively using these fancy neuro tools. The problem is that those tools aren't very accessible. They're really hard to take out of the lab and do anything with. They're very expensive to use. So Daniel and I have been looking at an alternative using what's called electrodermal activity, or used to be called the galvanic skin response. And the reason that this is potentially interesting is because your emotional, and a center in your brain called the amygdala is an emotional component. And what's interesting is as you have emotional ups and downs, it drives what's known as the hypothalamic pituitary axis. And I promise not to say that again. But that drives like adrenaline release in your body, which we can measure at the wrist using simple kind of biometric tools, wear and forget watches that measure this electrodermal activity. And we're not interested in electrodermal activity by itself. We're looking at how it goes up and down as an index of how you engage with the creative content. So this is the basics of the neuroscience that leads us into what we've been doing. I'd like to hand over to Daniel now to tell you a little bit more about that in detail.
Great, thank you, Joe. Yeah, so basically we just combined the last two slides that Joe showed. We took this logic of looking at the synchrony of the central nervous system activity, and we used this tool of EDA and put them together. So we use these devices called emotibits that are around this big and strapped to your finger and so on. And we can measure people's EDA signal while they're doing something, passively watching some content, typically a 3 or 4 minute, 30 or 40 second ad, or even a longer movie. And we look at the time course of that and we compute the synchrony. And in a series of experiments, we've used this methodology to ask some questions that are scientifically interesting to us, but also we think have some practical value as well. And I'm just going to run you through a few of those experiments that we've done already. So for example, we wanted to know, well, does this really predict anything in the real world? The same way as the brain activity predicted Super Bowl liking of those videos on YouTube, what can we predict? So we showed some Kickstarter adverts. These are things people put online to get funding for some business product idea that they have. And they have a target, and some reach them and some do not. And we showed people the pitch videos from the similar category of comic books and games and some socks as well, I think. And we measured their engagement and saw which had the greatest physiological synchrony, or neurological engagement, what's called. And we found that predicted which of these two pairs then got their funding. So we are tapping into something about people are engaged because of this. And then in the real world, that translates into giving more money. We also saw this with movie trailers. We took a dozen or so 30-second trailers for adverts. We measured engagement in the same way, put a number on them and sorted them, and then look at their global box office takings, I think 8 months or a year later. And what we found is if we ranked them and looked at how well they engaged the audience and how synchronized the signal was, that predicted those global box office takings later. So again, a connection between what people are doing in the lab and these tiny little sweat glands, and then what the whole world does in terms of its purchasing decision. We can also, so in those examples that I've shown you, we've taken one advert, compared it to 6 others, and we said, well, which is the most engaging, which is the best? But also a great strength of this technique is it doesn't just give you a number, one number for the ad, you can look at the time course. And that's quite different from what you have of explicit judgments of people saying they like the advert between 1 and 10. We can look millisecond by millisecond and see how that signal changes. So I'm going to show you an advert from Dairy Milk that might be familiar. And on the bottom is the neurological score. We've just shown you one number, summing that whole curve. Let me show you the time course of it, and then I'll pick out some features of this.
You'd have to throw that one back, Mr. Thompson.
There's a glass and a half in everyone.
Oh, it's still heartwarming. So if you ask people, did you like that advert? They might say yes. You might say, what did you like? And obviously it's that big, lovely payoff at the end. But that's about it in terms of what we can tell. But with this system, we can get the whole narrative arc. We get a big build-up right at the start, where you're basically establishing the premise that there's this grumpy guy and there's the kids next door and there's a bit of tension, right? From sort of a screenwriting perspective, that's what we'd hope to see, but we can measure it in their skin as well. So it's not just the final payoff, it's the journey of how we get there, and those narrative hooks we can see. And there's even little features in here. So you notice it goes humped like that, and then so there's a little blip as it's going back down. What's that little blip? That's the moment he turns on his hearing aid, which is sort of surprising the narrative, because you think he'll turn it off because he can't hear them, but he turns it on so he can hear the kids. That's when you think, oh, maybe he's not a grumpy old git. Maybe actually he wants a bit of human connection. Oh, they've given him chocolate. So all of these sort of nuanced things that I'm sure the creators spent a lot of time crafting, we can see the trace of them. Not just in was that a good ad? Yes, but moment by moment, we can pick them out. We can also look at sort of A/B testing of you've got a message, there are 2 different ways to get there. Can we show which is better? So these are 2 adverts for EDF, the power makers, generators, sellers, and they had 2 different pitches. One was focused on how they generated their electricity and it being through green methods. The other one focused on the fact you had a smart hub that would save you money. Both of these things are true. Both are motivators to be their customers. But since you're all creatives, I mean, maybe you could guess which one is more successful. We can use our science to actually measure that and find an answer from their engagement moment by moment. And what we found quite conclusively was that that generation one, the green energy one, more than the pounds in your pocket pitch, had a much higher engagement score. That seemed to be landing better with people. Not necessarily what we might predict, but something about that advert had a stronger hook than the other one we found. So we can do A/B testing in terms of which of 2 different themes are they that we want to look at. We can also look at A/B testing in taking in and out an element of an advert and seeing its effect. So one thing we tried this with is music. So this is a Christmas ad from Sainsbury's. This is from a few years ago. And we've subtracted that music soundtrack. Everything else is the same, but I'm going to take out the music soundtrack. Then I'm going to put it back in and see if you can intuit, see if you can reflect upon the difference this is making.
Like all great stories,
No music.
this one starts at the beginning.
Come on, you maggot! I don't not pay you to have fun. Exotic delicacies.
Now let me introduce it.
Far, far away. Thank you, Mrs. Sainsbury. Come on. Gotcha. Nicholas,
Very orchestral.
eh?
Now let's take it out again.
Orange Andy! What should we do with him? Banish him forever!
Let's put it back one more time.
It wasn't me.
Okay, we don't have to see the whole thing. But you notice the music didn't really sort of add anything to the explicit understanding. All the information was there. You knew what was happening. You could hear what was happening, but it was doing something and we could measure what it was doing. It was bringing people together emotionally. It was dictating the feelings. It was giving that undercurrent. When it disappeared, you almost didn't notice it wasn't there, but we can measure its effect. It was clearly doing something to increase the engagement. Again, even though there's no information, it's not helping you understand, but it is helping you feel a little bit. And we can detect that. So we can take music in or out. We can maybe do different soundtracks, different voice-over artists. We can look at all these different elements and then quantify how they're shifting the engagement. Something you maybe would only have an intuition about before, we can get numbers. And again, we're called the Neuronarrative Lab because we think the biggest hook of all is this narrative engagement. It's not just what is on screen moment by moment, it's that bigger representation of the story that you're seeing. We have evidence for that. This is one advert from Android. It's rather cute. It's about a piece of paper who goes the first day of school and he gets bullied, and then some scissors helps him, and then they go home and a rock bullies them, but then the paper helps them because paper beats rock. You see the hook. But it's a cute little story and there's fun things that are happening. And we took one edit, which is called edit one here, which is what you're looking at. And then we compared it to another edit where we just had the same thing, but we moved things around. The edit was disrupted. It wasn't as good edit. It didn't tell the story. And even though there was sort of a slight change, the same content was seen, but with slightly different cuts, just disrupting that narrative had a measurable effect. So those editors who you see really early on in the credits of a film, they are doing a job, and that is a measurable job. Exactly how you sell this story and how it lands, again, we can pick up. So those are just a few examples. We're asking other scientific questions. We're looking for other things we can predict in the real world, but that's just a few examples of the sort of applications we think, the sort of questions that this technique can answer. I'm going to hand over to Jules now to talk about, well, how could this be of use to you guys?
Hello. Yes. So as promised, we've got a one-time special offer for testing. It's a limited time frame, but I'll come back to details on that later. Next slide, please, Danny. You can test 2 ads or branded content up to 60 seconds, and they could be an A/B edit or 2 clients or your ad versus a competitor. Next slide, please, Daniel. And these ads will be tested on around 60 NatRep participants, and you'll get a results deck which measures engagement, effectiveness, recall, memory, and brand favorability. And you'll also get a walkthrough with either Joe or Daniel in person if you're in London, or via Zoom anywhere else. Next slide, please, Daniel. And all this for just £500 per pair of ads, and you can submit up to 3 pairs of content for £500 for each pair. Next slide. You can use this QR code you can see on the screen now to get a form for your ad testing. And while we take neuroscience very seriously, we've put together a light-hearted short film which we'll send to you that highlights some potentially outdated methods or some companies with no actual published neuroscientists involved. And you get a fun quiz, aptly named, Do You Know Your Neuroscience from Your Neurobollocks? You can contact us, next slide, Daniel, on admin@neuronarrativelab.com. So come and test your ads with us. And if you like the results of cutting edge neuroscience, we'll be happy to work with you. And just a note on those, the little sort of T's and C's for the ads need to be submitted before the 26th of October. The results will be ready by the last week of November, and we can schedule a time for a visit or a call to walk you through and explain the results and how you can use them. Yeah, send us your ads. Thanks.
And the other thing, we can stop sharing this, and we'll send you a link with that QR code and stuff, so that if you want to use it, if you didn't happen to catch it right there, no worries. But if anybody has any questions, I should have said from the beginning, please pop them into the Q&A. Thankfully, some people already have been doing that. But that's it for the sort of formal bit. We're happy to answer questions with anybody now. And as I said, what I'll do is I'll probably just moderate the questions and give them to the guys here. So the first one is from Anonymous. Thanks for this, guys. Really great. Having worked with EDA in the past, how do you account for the latency in EDA in your time series analysis? It was always a challenge for us.
Shall I take that?
You take that?
Oh, yeah, sure. That's a nice nerdy question for me. Yeah, so there's many different ways to use EDA. Since you talked about latency, what some people do is separate out the EDA into spikes and slower changes over time. The spikes have little latencies, but the slower one over time, the tonic, that does have a bigger latency. And what people do is separate out the signal, then try and interpret, is this me being sad? Is this me being angry? Is this me having a different level of arousal? And there's 30 years trying to figure this out. The advantage of our technique is we sidestep all of those problems. We don't have the latency problem. We don't have that problem of interpretation, because we don't have to say why we think if a peak means that you're excited or sad or aroused. We just look at how lots of people have a signal that's similar or not. So we don't try and interpret that signal other than saying, is it the same squiggly line amongst 40 people? And if it is, as Joe was laying out, that's because they're all attending to this thing. So we don't have to worry ourselves so much with that other level of interpretation that hasn't been very successful as a way to, you can't simply read that squiggly line and tell what people are feeling. But you can use it to tell if a large number of people are engaged, and that does seem to predict real world differences.
Thank you for that. And then Sean has asked a question. He says, hi lads, thanks for the presentation. Just one quick question on how you differentiate yourselves from, say, System 1's approach. One of you guys want to take that? I don't know. Daniel, you get stuck with all the questions, or do you guys, someone else want to jump in?
I can do the science side of it. I mean, System 1, I'm not sure specifically what System 1 do. Some companies will use facial recognition. So they'll have a webcam on someone while they're watching the video. And what you might find, for example, when you saw the Daily Milk, is people go at the end. In general, though, we know that facial expressions just don't really work like that. They're not a continuous readout of what we're feeling. We sort of thought that in the 90s and 80s with the work of people like Paul Ekman, but that's largely been left behind as a field. We think of emotions as a way to communicate with other people in real time. They're not just telling you what's on the inside. So simply pointing a camera at someone by themselves doesn't really give you a very useful signal whatsoever. Emotions are much more complicated than that. The display of emotions is way more complicated than we thought in the 80s and 90s. That's the consensus in the field right now. So facial recognition is fundamentally based on something that we thought was right in the mid-80s, like many things, but turned out not really to capture the phenomena very well. The other thing that some companies will use is a row of buttons, like those things when you use a toilet at the airport and said, how happy are you with your experience? And you'll use these buttons and sort of every 10 seconds you'll press, yes, I'm liking it, I'm not liking it. And you can get a squiggly line out of that. But what does it mean? Because it's a very weird thing. You're trying to measure engagement, but you're measuring it by disengaging people and getting to press buttons or twiddle a dial. So you sort of fumbled at the first thing here. The phenomena you're trying to measure is disrupted by the instrument you're using to measure it. So again, I don't know specifically which one System 1 used at what time, but there are sort of fundamental flaws in some of these measurement techniques, we think.
Cool, thank you. And Subhashis, and excuse me if I've mispronounced your name, asked, hey, does this work for audio and video content, presumably?
Definitely works for video content. Joe, you've done some stuff on audio content, haven't you? in the
We
past.
have, and the effects are less strong with just pure audio. So, for instance, radio ads, or we've done it with segments of audiobooks as well. So the synchrony is less pronounced, and that's just simply because there's less of a stimulus to drive that synchronous neural activity across the brain. So it works a little bit, but to be honest, the content that we're most confident about is audio visual. So when you have, it works with purely visual, but it works even better when you have audio visual information, like typical videos, whether they're digital or TV or live events. In fact, Tyrone asked a question saying, this all makes sense for linear, sit back and watch content. What about interactive content like a game, for example? And I believe, Daniel, you could maybe talk a little bit about some stuff you've done with Twitch.
Yeah, so our technique is the best when these 40 people or whatever that we're measuring are seeing exactly the same thing at the same time, because they're having a synchronous response. So in one sense, if you're doing a game where you're finding out your own thing, you might shoot someone up or you might race in a car, whatever it is. If you're doing very different things, that's going to introduce a difference and it ruins that sort of synchrony approach. However, there's two ways around that. One is to look at key moments in games, like sort of cutscenes that you know are exactly the same. So you might have got their different routes, but when we're having our peak thing of the boss dying, can we look at the engagement? So you can pick out moments when there's a similarity in that stimulus. The other thing you can do is look at mediums like Twitch. So we worked a lot with them. Twitch have an incredibly strong engagement from their consumers. They'll sit through more videos than sort of YouTube and other platforms, but Twitch themselves don't really know why. But it seems like they've got something that they've built up, some engagement in their customers that is very, very strong. And of course, in lots of times in Twitch, you're watching someone else play that game. This seems bizarre to anyone my age and over that you would watch someone else play a game. I mean, I guess that's what you do at a football match, right? It's not that crazy. But it does seem very, very engaging to do this sort of second person viewing. So if you had a particular, new version of your game and you found a Twitch streamer playing it, you can measure engagement of people, lots of people watching that streamer play that game and see if that was particularly better than some other game. So there's some interesting ways around that problem.
And then I missed one earlier from Fernando, my apologies, that said, don't you think that if you add a stimulus over the video, in this case music, it'll lead to increased brain activity? What I mean is, how do you know that the increased activity is something positive or related to the positive emotion or affects? So I'm interpreting that to mean, is it just the fact that there's more that's better, or is there something that you can tell about engagement using this neural synchrony? And again, Daniel, you're probably best suited to answer this one.
Yeah, so I don't think it's necessarily the case that more is producing more activity, because when you look at EDA, sometimes you downregulate, sometimes you upregulate, and it's a complicated mess. The EDA signal is not just how much processing am I doing, but it's how am I sort of responding and tuning to my environment. So I think adding more in, if it's inversive, doesn't mean I'm going to engage more. I might back off because that's too much, or that's something that I don't like. So I don't think you'd necessarily find that at all. At least that's not what we seem to be seeing.
That's right. And that's, I think, one of the issues with using some of the biometric approaches in the past has been that people were looking for more heart rate or less heart rate variability or more EDA activity. And the reality is sometimes more is better and sometimes more is worse. And it really depends very specifically on the content. One of the nice things about the synchrony is that we're not measuring more or less signal. We're measuring how it changes over time and how similar that is across your audience. When it's similar, that's indicative that they're all experiencing the same thing at the same way, and that's being driven by this creative content, really. And if it's being driven by the creative content, that means they're engaged, right? That's why it's predictive of market level success for these other measures, like the number of box office sales of movies in the first week. And that's what we think is the fundamental advance in the recent neuroscience that is exciting to us, because it's a non-invasive way that doesn't involve asking people about their experience, having them reflect on it and introducing all of those biases. It doesn't involve taking their attention away from that material. And it doesn't rely on sort of reading the tea leaves in terms of is more better or is more worse. It's a quantitative way of saying, look, this is the level of engagement you're getting with this particular audience group. And we know that that engagement is actually predictive of important real life things like brand consideration, memory for the content, and even sales for things like, movies. So that's what's got us excited about all this. And that's why we're hoping that some of you out there who might be interested in collaborating, testing some of the ads that you're creating or your client, are doing. That's why we try to put together tonight in this offer in hopes that we can get some of you guys on board working with us to come up with ways of testing these things with your content.
I think it's also worth mentioning a lot of the research there was just on sort of national representative audience groups. But if you wanted to test, let's say, the same ad on different audience groups, you can do that. It costs a little bit more, and that probably won't be in the offer. But further down the line, if you said, well, how does this ad land in different geographies around the UK? How does it land with different demographics? How does it land? You've got if it's heavily leaning into LGBTQ plus, or it's about diversity, basically it's a way to basically see to which audience groups lean in and which ones don't. So as well as for the creative industry to really understand how their creative is working, it's really useful, I think, for the media industry to go, well, where shall I invest my marketing money in terms of which platforms, which demographics, which audiences? Because you probably go and invest in the areas that, with audiences that probably lean into that most. And then the other bit as well is sort of, we can do contextual testing, so different length of ads. So obviously, advertising isn't just a one size fits all. So how does a 10-second ad compare with a 20-second ad, compare with a 30-second ad, which then allows you to test different ads, because obviously you'll have different length of ads on TikTok or YouTube or on linear, that kind of stuff. So there's lots of different ways of cutting this up. So today was mainly about the national geography, but if you want to get more sort of scientific and a deeper dive on specific audience groups, we can do that as well.
Excellent. Thanks, James. And guys, I'm sensitive to the fact that we've overrun a bit at this point, but really appreciate all of you taking your time attending to this, hopefully even engaging with it. We will send you a follow-up email with the video that Jules mentioned, the link to the form if you do want to work with us. And also, we've done a recording of this, so you don't have to have caught every little bit of it. You can always go back and have a look. But if you have any questions, the deck includes our email address. Do just reach out to us. We'd be happy to chat with you. And thank you very much. Really appreciate your time and attention tonight.